What if the person you loved most disappeared one day, but you kept waiting for them, believing they would come back? This is the incredible story of Hachiko, a dog whose loyalty became so powerful that an entire nation eventually stopped to remember him. Before we begin, support the channel by subscribing and liking the video, because you won't want to miss what happened at the end of Hachiko's journey. And remember this question as you listen. How long would you wait for someone you loved? Because Hachiko waited for nearly 10 years, the beginning of an unforgettable story. In the early 1920s, in the Japanese city of Odaitte, in Akita Prefecture, a small Akita puppy was born. His name was Hachi. He was born in 1923, and while nobody could have known it at the time, this little dog would eventually become one of the most famous animals in Japanese history. But Hachi's life did not begin with fame. There were no cameras following him, no crowds, no statues, no newspapers telling his story. He was simply a young puppy waiting for the person who would become the center of his world. In 1924, Hachi was brought to Tokyo and became the companion of Professor Hidesaburo Ueno, a professor at Tokyo Imperial University. Professor Ueno was known to be very fond of dogs. Hachi was still young and somewhat weak when he arrived, but Ueno cared for him carefully and treated him with affection, and something beautiful began to happen. Hachi and Professor Ueno developed a daily routine. Every morning, the professor would leave home for work, and Hachi would accompany him. Every evening, Hachi would wait for his return. To Hachi, this wasn't a special occasion. It was simply life. His person left, his person came back, and Hachi was always there. But one day, Professor Ueno would leave home and never return. The day everything changed. It was May 21st, 1925. Hachi was still a young dog. That morning, everything appeared normal. The professor went to the university as usual. Hachi had no reason to believe that this day would be different from any other. But while at the university, Professor Ueno suddenly suffered a fatal cerebral hemorrhage. He died that day. He would never walk through the station again. He would never open the door. He would never call Hachi's name. And most importantly, Hachi never got the chance to understand what had happened. That evening, Hachi went looking for him. He waited, but the professor didn't come. Perhaps Hachi thought there had simply been a delay. Perhaps he expected to hear familiar footsteps. Perhaps he believed that tomorrow would be different. But tomorrow came, and Professor Ueno still didn't return. According to the University of Tokyo's account, Hachi even spent 3 days refusing food after the professor's death. And then something extraordinary began. Hachi started returning to the place where he had once waited for his owner, Shibuya Station. Reastamdal, the dog who wouldn't give up. At first, Hachi was not treated like a hero. To many people around the station, he was simply a stray dog. Some people didn't understand why he kept coming back. Why would a dog return to the same place day after day? There was no food waiting for him, no owner waiting to take him home. No reason, from a human perspective, to continue. But Hachi kept coming, morning after morning, evening after evening, rain or sunshine. He returned to Shibuya Station, looking for the man who had once been there. There is an important detail in this story. Hachi did not spend every second of his life standing in exactly the same spot. He lived with different people for periods of time, and eventually stayed with Kikusaburo Kobayashi, a gardener who had been connected to Professor Ueno. Yet Hachi continued making his way to Shibuya, and that is what made his behavior so remarkable. He could have accepted another home, he could have forgotten the routine, but every day seemed to bring him back to the same question: where is my master? Then someone finally told his story. For years, Hachi's routine was mostly known by people around the station, but in 1932, everything changed. A newspaper article about the loyal dog was published in Asahi Shimbun. Suddenly, people across Japan learned about the strange dog who continued waiting for his dead master, and the reaction was enormous. People began coming to see Hachi. Some brought him food, others simply wanted to witness the dog for themselves. The animal who had once been ignored was suddenly famous, but fame didn't change Hachi. He didn't suddenly begin performing tricks. He didn't understand newspapers. He didn't know that strangers were talking about him. He simply continued doing what he had done before, waiting. And this is perhaps the most touching part of his story. Hachi didn't wait because he wanted to become famous. He waited because, in his world, his relationship with Professor Ueno had never truly ended. As Hachi became more famous, his story began to represent something much bigger than one dog and one professor. To many people, Hachi became a symbol of loyalty, devotion, and gratitude. Teachers and parents used his story as an example for children. People began calling him Hachiko, with the honorific ko added to his name, and then came a moment Hachi could never have understood. People decided to build a statue in his honor. In 1934, a bronze statue of Hachiko was erected in front of Shibuya Station, and unbelievably, Hachi himself was present at the unveiling ceremony. Imagine the scene. Crowds of people gathered, a statue stood before them, and nearby was the real dog who had inspired it, the very same dog who had spent years returning to that station, the very same dog who still seemed to be waiting. But Hachiko's story wasn't over. You might think that becoming famous and receiving a statue would be the end of the story. It wasn't. Hachi continued visiting the station. He continued living his strange and remarkable routine. Year after year, the puppy from 1924 was now an old dog. His body was no longer young. His life had become difficult, but he still returned. Then, on March 8, 1935, Hachiko died in Shibuya. He was about 11 years old. For nearly 10 years after Professor Ueno's death, Hachi had continued returning to the place where he had once expected to see him. And when news of Hachi's death spread, people mourned him. The dog, who had once been a lonely figure near a train station, had become a national symbol. But there was one final twist to his story. Hachiko was gone, but his story didn't disappear. The statue remained. People continued remembering him. His story was passed from generation to generation, and eventually, Hachiko became known far beyond Japan. Books were written about him. Films were made about him in Japan, the United States, and China. Statues connected to his story were erected in several places, including Shibuya and his birthplace in Odate. Even today, the famous Hachiko statue in Shibuya remains associated with one of Tokyo's best-known meeting places. And there is something almost poetic about that. Hachiko spent years waiting for someone who never returned. Today, millions of people pass through the same city and remember the dog who refused to forget. Nunum beams mumswem. Maybe it's something deeper. Hachiko's story reminds us that love doesn't always disappear just because someone is gone. Sometimes, the people and animals who change our lives leave something behind that cannot be measured. A memory, a habit, a feeling, a place. For Professor Ueno, Hachi was a beloved dog. For Hachi, Professor Ueno was his world. And after Ueno disappeared, Hachi continued living according to the last routine they had shared. He didn't know that the man he was waiting for had died. He simply remembered that this was where they had once met. And perhaps that is why his story continues to touch people nearly a century later, because deep down, many of us understand what it means to wait. We wait for people. We wait for answers. We wait for second chances. We wait for someone to come back. But Hachiko teaches us another lesson too. The most meaningful relationships are not measured by how long they last, but by how deeply they change us. Mindao 9. Minimas bio Hachiko. And the person you loved most never came back. Would you keep waiting? Maybe you would. Maybe you wouldn't. There is no simple answer. But Hachiko's story leaves us with something unforgettable. He arrived as an ordinary dog. He lived as a loyal companion, and he left the world as a symbol of love and loyalty. If this story touched you, subscribe to Storyverse, leave a comment telling us what Hachiko's story means to you, and share this video with someone who loves animals, because sometimes the smallest creatures leave the biggest stories behind.